In early July 1970, the U.S. 101st Airborne Division launched what commanders described as a limited operation in the Washoe Valley, a narrow, forested corridor along the Laotian border that had long served as a key infiltration route for the North Vietnamese Army. The objective seemed simple: re-establish Firebase Ripcord, a hilltop artillery base abandoned the previous year, and use it to support sweeping operations down the valley. On paper, it was routine. In practice, it was suicide. The Washoe Valley was one of the most fortified regions in South Vietnam, laced with hidden bunkers, anti-aircraft guns, and camouflage trails. It was, as one officer later said, the enemy's backyard. The 101st Airborne, veterans of countless airborne and air mobile operations, began rotating battalions into the area in late June. The landing zone, a scar of red earth carved from dense jungle, was barely large enough for 2 helicopters at a time. When the first platoons touched down, they were met not by gunfire, but by silence, the eerie quiet that precedes an ambush. Engineers immediately began rebuilding defensive positions, stacking sandbags, digging trenches, and clearing brush. The hilltop itself, bare and windswept, offered little shelter. By nightfall, men slept in mud, their ponchos fluttering in the wind. The rain came daily and without warning. From the air, Ripcord looked insignificant, a lonely bump amid a sea of green. But its strategic position made it essential. The NVA had long used the Washoe Valley as a supply artery, moving troops and weapons from Laos into South Vietnam. Establishing an American base there threatened that corridor. The North Vietnamese command quickly took notice. Intelligence intercepts later revealed that several NVA regiments began surrounding the hill even before U.S. engineers finished rebuilding it. The stage was set for a confrontation no one in the 101 had anticipated. The first sign came on July 1st. A mortar round landed near the helicopter pad, wounding 3 men and scattering a pile of ammunition. The shelling stopped as quickly as it started, but the message was clear. Ripcord was marked. Patrols sent into the jungle encountered tripwires, punji stakes, and snipers who vanished into the trees. By July 4, the base was receiving fire almost daily. The enemy had the high ground. Their guns were hidden in the folds of the surrounding ridges. Every time a helicopter came in, tracer rounds streaked through the air like burning ropes. In this chaos, the black soldiers of Ripcord began to earn an unspoken respect. They took on the hardest jobs, repairing radio antennas under fire, dragging wounded men through mud, hauling mortar shells up the slope when helicopters couldn't land. Private Alonzo Griffin, a field radio operator from Newark, remembered climbing from trench to trench during barrages just to keep the communication lines alive. "I stopped being scared of dying," he said years later. "You just focused on keeping the next man alive." At night, the air filled with the smell of wet soil and diesel fuel. Fires burned in metal drums, lighting the faces of exhausted men covered in grime. The sounds of distant explosions echoed through the valley like thunder. Conversations were short, sometimes bitter, but always practical. Everyone knew the base could fall, yet no one spoke about retreat. Orders were to hold, and they did. By the second week, Ripcord had already taken dozens of casualties. Helicopters brought in replacements, supplies, and body bags in the same rotation. The 101st Command assured reporters that operations were progressing as planned. What they didn't say was that the hill was already surrounded. Every incoming flight was taking fire, and every patrol sent beyond the perimeter returned with fewer men than it left with. The soldiers began calling it the hill that eats people. Still, morale didn't collapse entirely. Within the base, small acts of defiance kept men sane. Someone painted Harlem Hill on a bunker wall. Another strung up a battered transistor radio that played soul music between bombardments. A few soldiers kept a running tally of incoming shells on a piece of plywood. They stopped counting after 500. In a war defined by chaos, Ripcord became a small world of its own, a world held together by grit, routine, and the stubborn will to survive. To the outside world, Ripcord barely existed. It was not on the evening news, nor mentioned in official briefings. But within the ranks of the 101st, rumors spread fast. Men whispered that the base wouldn't last another week. The North Vietnamese were massing artillery. Some commanders argued for withdrawal, but the order never came. The higher-ups wanted to keep pressure on the valley, to prove that the U.S. could still control the terrain. What they didn't admit was that the hilltop, the one that wasn't supposed to matter, had become a trap. By July 10, the enemy had the range of every gun on the hill. Shells landed on fuel dumps, tore through bunkers, and shredded tents. Yet the defenders stayed, fighting back with whatever artillery they could keep functional. The sound of explosions never stopped, day or night. The base that was meant to project power had turned into a symbol of endurance, a hilltop fortress of mud, sweat, and defiance. And among its defenders, those who had been dismissed as unreliable or expendable were proving otherwise. They were the hands repairing the broken guns, the backs carrying ammunition through fire, and the voices shouting orders when others fell silent. Ripcord had not been meant to matter, but for the men trapped on it, it was now the whole war distilled into one place. By the second week of July 1970, Firebase Ripcord had become a trap. The jungle around the hill was alive with movement, unseen but constant. The North Vietnamese army had positioned artillery and mortars on every ridge, creating a deadly ring of fire. From dawn until dusk, shells screamed overhead, striking bunkers, fuel drums, and the fragile helicopter pad. The ground trembled so often that men stopped reacting to the explosions. Sleep came in short, restless bursts, broken by the dull thud of incoming rounds. Those who had thought of the firebase as temporary now realized they might die there. Helicopters were the only lifeline. Every delivery, food, water, ammunition, or stretchers, required pilots to fly through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire. Many aircraft returned riddled with holes. Others never returned at all. Soldiers watched in silence when a chopper went down in flames. There was no ceremony, no pause. Within minutes, the next flight came in. Pilots who had once complained about risk now volunteered for the runs, unwilling to leave their comrades stranded. Among them were African American crews who had earned reputations as crazy brave. Men who would fly through the worst weather and the worst fire because they refused to leave anyone behind. On the ground, the 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, the Karihis, bore the brunt of the siege. They were young, weary, and under constant pressure. More than a third of the defenders were black soldiers. Many had entered the war already fighting stereotypes, accusations of insubordination, laziness, or cowardice that circulated through the ranks of a divided army. But on Ripcord, under ceaseless fire, those labels disintegrated. The same men who had been dismissed by officers as unreliable were now the ones keeping the base alive. Every day began with labor. Trenches had to be deepened, sandbags stacked higher. The heat was punishing, and the red clay turned to cement beneath their boots. When mortar rounds hit, they threw dirt and shrapnel into the air, filling lungs with dust. Yet the work never stopped. The black soldiers of C and D companies hauled crates of 105mm shells up the slopes, repaired damaged weapons, and dragged wounded men to the medevac zone. Their sweat coated the sandbags that kept the perimeter intact. For them, survival had become a job, not an act of courage, but of endurance. In one of the few surviving reports, a platoon leader described how a fire broke out after a direct hit on the ammunition dump. Flames shot into the air, and rounds began to cook off inside the crates. It was Private Leonard Davis, a black mechanic from Baltimore, who ran into the blaze with a shovel, throwing dirt over the nearest shells until others joined him. They stopped the fire just before it reached the mortar pit. No medals were given, but the men who saw it never forgot. At night, the air was thick with the smell of diesel, smoke, and rot. The base looked like a flickering island in a dark ocean. Soldiers crouched in foxholes, their hands blackened by grease and soot, their rifles slick with oil. Between attacks, they joked, argued, or stared into the distance. When the shelling paused long enough for helicopters to land, men shouted above the noise, waving for supplies. Every box dropped from the sky meant a few more hours of life. The psychological strain was immense. The radio chatter carried snippets of panic from nearby positions, calls for medevac, coordinates for artillery fire, reports of men missing in the jungle. Yet within the chaos, discipline hardened. The black troops, many of them veterans of earlier fights at Hue and Khe Sanh, moved with quiet precision. They no longer waited for orders that might never come. If a gun jammed, they fixed it. If a bunker collapsed, they rebuilt it. Private First Class Albert Riggins, a 19-year-old from Chicago, later told interviewers, "They said we'd break. They said we couldn't handle the pressure. But when it hit, we were the ones still standing." His words weren't prideful, they were matter-of-fact. He described nights when tracer fire stitched the sky like lightning, and the rain turned blood into mud. He remembered carrying a wounded white soldier on his back through shell fire. He was crying, Riggins said. "I told him, 'You'll make it. We both will.'" He stopped crying after that. The irony was that while Ripcord burned, the division's headquarters down in Phu Bai remained detached. Reports came in stripped of identity. Casualties were just numbers. There was no mention of who manned the machine guns longest, who ran ammunition through open ground, or who pulled pilots from burning helicopters. In official language, the siege was described as intense but under control. For those on the Hell, it was survival by inches. Inside the perimeter, race briefly lost meaning. The sound of incoming fire erased every other difference. Men shared cigarettes, traded canteens, and watched each other's backs. But the truth of who carried the fight was obvious to everyone who lived it. The black soldiers were the ones on the front berms, in the pits, at the broken guns. Even some white officers later admitted that their courage and composure under pressure had kept Ripcord from collapsing sooner. Still, resentment lingered beneath the surface. When replacements arrived, fresh from the rear, some carried the same old prejudices. They learned quickly how misplaced those beliefs were. Within days, those rear echelon attitudes were burned away by the reality of artillery fire and exhaustion. On Ripcord, equality wasn't a slogan, it was enforced by survival. The siege's second week ended with more dead and wounded than anyone dared count. Men stopped writing home. The mail couldn't get through anyway. Nights stretched endlessly, punctuated by flares and the constant hum of mosquitoes. But the rumor began to spread through radio traffic across the valley. The black troops on Ripcord are still holding. It was passed along from pilot to pilot, whispered in bunkers, even noted and intercepted enemy transmissions. The NVA, too, had noticed that the Americans were not breaking. By then, the base had ceased to be a military objective and become something else, a test of endurance, faith, and willpower. The North Vietnamese kept pounding, confident the Americans would finally withdraw. But every morning, the same silhouettes appeared on the berm, loading guns and scanning the jungle. The phrase, "they said we'd break," took on a grim irony. It was repeated among the men like a taunt, a challenge to the fate hanging over them. They hadn't broken, not from the artillery, not from the heat, not from the fear. The hill still stood, and so did they. As July wore on, the siege tightened. The defenders were running low on everything: water, ammunition, even strength. Yet Ripcord remained alive, held together by the same soldiers the army had once dismissed. They were exhausted, filthy, and half-deaf from weeks of bombardment. But they stayed in the fight. The stereotype had been shattered. The men who weren't supposed to last this long had become the backbone of a dying hill. And as one weary sergeant muttered into his helmet after another night of fire, "They said we'd break. Looks like we're the ones keeping this place from falling apart." Every few minutes, a round slammed into the slope, sending showers of dirt and shrapnel across the trenches. The earth itself seemed to vibrate. Communication wires were shredded daily, only to be spliced and rerouted by men crawling through mud under fire. Radios crackled constantly with calls for medevac and ammunition. "We were living inside a thunderstorm," one survivor said. "Every breath smelled like explosives." Helicopters became the heartbeat of Ripcord. Without them, the base would die. But getting in or out of the valley was a gamble with death. The airspace above Ripcord was a funnel of smoke and tracer rounds. Pilots came in low, their rotors chopping through smoke and debris. Many of those daring aviators were African American, men who had fought for the right to fly in a military still divided by race. They had no armor, no escort, just the nerve to land where no one else could. They hovered over explosions, ignoring radio pleas to abort, until stretchers were loaded or crates of ammunition thrown off. Some never lifted again. On July 18, disaster struck. Around mid-morning, a series of direct hits tore through the northeastern perimeter. Sandbags erupted, bunkers collapsed, and the NVA stormed the gap. Chaos followed. Smoke and dust turned the hill into a blur of movement, shouting, gunfire, explosions. Sergeant James Red Jenkins, a 31-year-old squad leader from Detroit, took charge of what was left of his platoon. Jenkins was known for his calm demeanor and his drawl that could be heard even over gunfire. When the call came that the line had been breached, he didn't wait for orders. He gathered his men, mostly young black soldiers who had joined the army straight from city neighborhoods, and led them up the slope. They fought through a rain of shrapnel and mud, tossing grenades ahead of them, firing M16s into the smoke. The air stank of gunpowder and wet earth. Jenkins was hit once in the shoulder and again in the leg, but refused to stop. "If we lose that line," he shouted, "we lose the hill." His men pushed forward until the NVA finally withdrew, leaving behind weapons and bodies tangled in wire. Jenkins survived, though barely. Of his squad, only 4 men were still standing. When the firing subsided, the survivors crawled back to the bunkers. There was no cheering, no victory, just silence, broken by the sound of helicopters circling above. Jenkins was carried to the medevac zone, bleeding through his bandages, still insisting on staying. The medics forced him aboard. That night, his name went over the radio, marked as severely wounded. No one on Ripcord forgot his stand. For the rest of the siege, his platoon's position became known simply as Red's Line. The next days blurred together. There were no shifts, no sleep cycles. Men slept when the shells paused, often sitting upright, rifles across their laps. The rain was constant. Mud filled foxholes faster than it could be drained. Uniforms never dried. Rations turned to paste. Yet even in that misery, discipline held. Black soldiers, once dismissed by certain officers as undisciplined or political, became the glue that kept the base functional. They manned the machine guns at night, repaired mortars under bombardment, and hauled ammo from downed helicopters. Lieutenant Harold Pierce, one of the few black officers in the battalion, described it years later. "We weren't fighting for medals. We were fighting for the man next to us. That's what held Ripcord together. Every time someone said they can't handle pressure, we showed them we could handle the world falling apart." The enemy didn't relent.
Each night, flares illuminated the valley as if daylight had returned. The NVA launched probing assaults, testing the wire, firing RPGs into bunkers, then fading into the darkness. Every morning, the smell of cordite and burned foliage lingered over the hill. The medics ran out of morphine. The cooks stopped cooking. There was no time. Meals were cold sea rations eaten in silence. The only constant sound was artillery. American guns answering the enemy, their barrels glowing red after days of use.
Helicopters brought in ammunition and carried out the dead, often in the same flight. Some of the pilots painted slogans on their aircraft doors in black marker, small messages meant for the men below. Hold Ripcord. Back with more. We see you. These brief words, shouted through rotor wash, meant everything to the soldiers trapped on the ground. By now, the base was unrecognizable. Craters overlapped craters. Trees that once ringed the perimeter were splintered stumps. The air smelled of fuel and decay. Men's faces were gray from dust and fatigue, their eyes bloodshot. They stopped shaving, stopped cleaning their weapons unless absolutely necessary. They counted time not in days, but in shells. Every sunrise meant we'd made it another night, one gunner said. The bond between the soldiers grew stronger the longer they endured. In the face of constant fire, racial tension, still simmering elsewhere in Vietnam, faded on the hill. There was no black or white when carrying a bleeding man through a rain of shrapnel. But among themselves, the black troops of Ripcord carried an unspoken pride. They had heard what some officers said about them, that they were prone to panic, that they lacked the discipline to hold under siege. Yet here they were, the ones still firing when others faltered. Rumors spread through radio channels again. The black troops are still holding Ripcord. It was said with admiration now, not surprise. Their composure under pressure became legend among nearby units. In Phu Bai, where the division headquarters listened to the reports, someone remarked, "Whoever's on that hill, they're earning every inch." The siege reached a rhythm of horror and routine. Shelling at dawn, sniper fire at noon, airstrikes in the evening. The men stopped caring about the official purpose of Ripcord. It wasn't about strategy anymore. It was about proving they could endure what no one else could. You stopped thinking about the big picture, Riggins later said. You just focused on staying alive long enough to see the next helicopter come in. By the third week, Firebase Ripcord existed only through stubbornness and sheer will. Every gun crew, every medic, every runner kept moving through exhaustion that bordered on collapse. Their world had narrowed to a single command: hold the line. And somehow, amid the flames and thunder, they did. Helicopters still came. Guns still fired. The hill, though half destroyed, was still theirs. It wasn't strategy that kept Ripcord alive. It was endurance, the kind forged not in training manuals or reports, but in the quiet defiance of men who refused to break. When one black helicopter crew painted a new message on their Huey door before takeoff, "If they fall, we fall," no one on Ripcord doubted they meant it. For 23 days, under skies filled with fire, the hill endured. And the soldiers who weren't supposed to last had become the reason it still existed at all. At dawn on July 22, 1970, the mist over the Ah Chau Valley was thick enough to blur the ridgelines. But the men at Firebase Ripcord knew something was coming. The night before, the shelling had intensified to a level no one had seen before. Sustained, methodical, and terrifyingly accurate. Patrols sent out after midnight never returned. The base's few remaining artillery pieces had overheated from constant firing. Ammunition was low, food nearly gone, and half the bunkers had been destroyed by direct hits. The men were exhausted beyond reason, their faces streaked with mud and soot. For 3 weeks they had fought without rest.
Now the enemy was closing in for the final blow. At 6 a.m., the first 122mm shells began to fall in synchronized volleys. The explosions came so fast that they blended into one continuous roar. Shrapnel tore through sandbags and helmets. The air filled with the acrid stench of burning fuel and soil. The NVA had brought in reinforcements, at least 2 regiments, surrounding Ripcord from 3 sides. Under the cover of their artillery barrage, North Vietnamese infantry began moving uphill through the fog. Every few minutes, the defenders could hear whistles and shouted orders in Vietnamese. Then the sound of automatic fire would erupt from the tree line. Inside the command bunker, chaos reigned. Radio contact with supporting artillery units was lost after a shell severed the communication lines. The command post itself took a direct hit, collapsing part of the roof and killing several officers instantly. Those still able to move crawled out through the smoke and debris, clutching radios and maps. The air was so thick with dust that men shouted to recognize one another. A few tried to re-establish a defensive perimeter, but the incoming rounds never stopped long enough to reorganize. By mid-morning, the attack was in full force. The defenders, mostly from C Company, 2nd Battalion, 506th Infantry, were spread thin along the ridgeline. Nearly half of them were African American soldiers, many of whom had joined the Army's most dangerous division at a time when few believed they belonged there. Now, in the inferno of Ripcord, they stood shoulder to shoulder with white and Latino comrades, returning fire from trenches that were little more than pits of mud and blood. Machine guns rattled until the barrels glowed red. Mortar crews, working with bare hands, dropped shells so fast that the tubes burned their palms. Sergeant Curtis Malone, a black squad leader from Baltimore, recalled years later that the sky just split open. He described crawling between craters to rally scattered men. You couldn't see more than 20 feet, he said. There was fire everywhere, and we were the only ones left on that side of the hill. His squad had started the day with 9 men. By noon, only 3 were still alive. When the NVA broke through the wire, Malone's remaining soldiers counterattacked with grenades and rifles at point-blank range, pushing the enemy back just long enough for helicopters to arrive. The first evacuation order came around noon, but calling for extraction and executing it were 2 different things. The landing zone had been cratered beyond use. Smoke and fog made visibility almost zero. Helicopters circled above, taking fire from anti-aircraft guns hidden in the valley. The pilots could barely find the base. Only the flames marked its position. When they finally descended, they hovered inches above the ground, their rotors kicking up a storm of dust and debris. Soldiers ran through smoke, carrying the wounded or dragging them on ponchos. Witnesses said some of the black soldiers refused to leave until others were safe. Specialist Albert Riggins, who had survived every day of the siege, was seen hauling a wounded white medic to the extraction zone. When someone shouted for him to get on the chopper, he shook his head and went back for another man. Others covered the retreat, firing from the trenches until their weapons jammed. "We were supposed to hold until the last," one survivor recalled, "so that's what they did." At one point, an enemy shell struck a fuel drum near the helipad, igniting a fireball that engulfed the entire landing area. The flames forced helicopters to lift off prematurely, some with men still clinging to the skids. Pilots shouted through the noise, trying to count who was aboard, but there was no order, only desperation. One Huey, overloaded and hit in the tail rotor, spun out of control and crashed into the tree line. Another managed to rise through the smoke, trailing flames. "It looked like hell itself was lifting off the hill," said a gunner from a nearby aircraft. By late afternoon, the evacuation turned into a rescue mission. The last functioning radio on the hill set out the coded phrase, "Ripcord breaking." Overhead, gunships strafed the jungle to cover the retreat. The defenders fell back to the few craters that still offered protection, firing until they ran out of ammunition. When the final helicopter came in, only a handful of soldiers were left on the slope. Some were too wounded to move, others stayed to help them. The rotors chopped the smoke, the door gunners yelled for them to climb aboard, but there was no time. The pilot, hit by shrapnel, lifted off as tracers lit the air around him. When the last helicopter disappeared into the clouds, the hill went quiet for the first time in weeks. Only the crackle of burning debris broke the silence. Firebase Ripcord, once the symbol of U.S. persistence in the Ashau Valley, was gone. The remaining defenders who couldn't be evacuated were presumed dead or captured. Hours later, North Vietnamese soldiers moved cautiously up the slope, stepping over shell casings and bodies. What they found was not a victory. It was a graveyard. The cost was devastating. 75 Americans were killed, more than 400 wounded, and dozens missing. Many of the dead were never recovered. The bombardment had erased their positions from the hilltop. Intelligence estimates later confirmed that the NVA had suffered far greater losses, over 500 dead and countless wounded. But it was a hollow statistic. The hill was gone, the mission failed, and the men who had held it were scattered across evacuation hospitals. At division headquarters, the decision was made to bury the story. Reporters were told only that a fire support base had been withdrawn due to enemy activity. No mention of the scale of the fighting, the losses, or the chaos that ended it. With the nation already weary of Vietnam, the Army feared comparisons to Khe Sanh, another prolonged siege that had raised questions about the war's purpose. The survivors of Ripcord received no parades, no press coverage, and for many, not even official recognition of their heroism. But among the men who lived through it, the truth was never forgotten. They remembered who had manned the machine guns when everyone else was gone, who had pulled the wounded to safety, who had refused to abandon the hill. They remembered the names of those who never made it to the helicopters, the ones who had been called troublemakers or unfit before the siege began. In the quiet years that followed, when veterans gathered in small reunions, they spoke of Ripcord not as a defeat, but as proof of endurance. They said we'd break, one survivor repeated decades later, but we didn't. We held until the sky fell. And when the official histories of the war finally mentioned Firebase Ripcord, they did so in cautious tones, describing strategy, logistics, numbers. But the men who had been there remembered it differently. To them, it was the day the earth shook, the sky turned to fire, and the soldiers who weren't supposed to matter proved that they were the last ones standing. When Firebase Ripcord finally fell silent, the men who had survived were airlifted out in small groups, exhausted, wounded, and numb. For them, the siege did not end when the last helicopter left the hill. It followed them wherever they went. Within days, the survivors were reassigned to other units scattered across South Vietnam. Some went north toward Hue, others south toward Phu Bai or Da Nang. A few were evacuated home on medical grounds. None were given time to process what had happened. The official message was simple: Ripcord was over. But for those who had lived through 23 days of unrelenting bombardment, nothing about it was over. The Army moved quickly to suppress discussion of the battle. Headquarters labeled the operation a tactical withdrawal and instructed unit historians to keep references to the siege minimal. The after-action reports used vague language: enemy engagement, sustained defense, high-intensity combat. There were no detailed lists of who held which position, who volunteered for rescue missions, or who carried ammunition through fire. In the paperwork, the battle became statistics, the men became anonymous entries, and the race of those who had done the hardest fighting vanished completely from the record. For the soldiers themselves, returning to base camps felt surreal. After weeks of siege, the relative quiet was unbearable. Helicopter blades still triggered instinctive dives into the dirt.
The smell of fuel or the sound of thunder made them reach for rifles that were no longer in their hands. Some found comfort in each other, small groups of survivors who recognized the same thousand-yard stare. They gathered at night, away from officers, sharing cigarettes and stories in low voices. Those conversations, spoken between men who had survived what the Army refused to acknowledge, became the only memorial Ripcord had. Racial divisions, briefly erased by survival, returned almost immediately. In rear areas, the old segregation resurfaced, not by regulation, but by habit. Black soldiers found themselves unwelcome in certain clubs, mocked in others, and quietly excluded from promotion boards. For them, the return to normal Army life was a cruel step backward. They had fought beside white comrades, defended the same hill, and held a position everyone said was impossible to hold. Yet when the crisis ended, the respect faded as quickly as it had appeared. Private Albert Riggins, who had been 19 when Ripcord fell, described the shift years later. "When we were up there, color didn't matter. A man was a man if he could fight. But once we got back to the rear, it was like none of that ever happened. They went back to calling us troublemakers." Riggins, like many others, was rotated out of combat within weeks and spent the remainder of his tour in logistics, an assignment he described as punishment for surviving. Despite the silence from above, word of Ripcord circulated among troops in the field. Helicopter crews who had flown resupply runs into the siege told the story in bars and airstrips. Artillerymen who had fired support missions whispered that the men on that hill had fought like ghosts, refusing to surrender even when their guns melted from heat. Slowly, the legend of Ripcord spread through the ranks, passed along in fragments, a name, a date, a line from a radio transmission. It became a soldier's story, not an official one. For the black veterans who had lived through it, Ripcord meant more than survival. It was proof, bitter and undeniable, that their courage had never been the issue. In interviews decades later, several recalled how they'd been labeled cowards or unreliable before deployment. Some had been passed over for promotion or threatened with disciplinary action for minor infractions. But when the hill came under siege, they were the ones who stayed. "We didn't have the luxury of being scared," one former gunner said. "We were already fighting two wars, one against the enemy and one against what people thought we were." When the survivors were finally flown back to the United States, they returned to an America already tired of the war. Protesters filled college campuses, calling soldiers murderers or victims. For the men of Ripcord, there were no parades, no recognition. Some were discharged quietly, others reassigned to training units. A few tried to tell their stories, but the press was no longer interested in heroism, only in withdrawal and peace talks. Ripcord had no symbolic victory, no clear lesson. It was easier to forget. Still, memories endured in silence. Many of the men who had fought there found themselves haunted by the sound of helicopters, the thump of blades echoing in their dreams. They remembered the smell of burning JP-4 jet fuel that had coated the hill, the metallic taste of dirt mixed with blood, and the rain that turned the red clay into something that looked like flesh. For years they would wake at night, convinced they were still in those trenches, still waiting for the next shell to fall. Some of them began writing to each other in the 1980s after veterans organizations started collecting oral histories. They exchanged letters and cassette tapes, piecing together the fragments of the siege that official history had erased. Through those conversations, the role of the black soldiers, the men who had hauled ammunition, carried wounded comrades, and manned the guns until the end, began to surface again. Their stories revealed what the reports had omitted, that courage on Ripcord had no color, but recognition did. When historians at Texas Tech University's Vietnam Center began archiving interviews in the 1990s, the survivors finally had a place to speak freely.
Riggins gave his testimony in 1994. He said, "They told us we couldn't lead, couldn't fight, couldn't handle pressure. But up there, on that hill, we were the ones who stayed." His voice, steady but tired, carried the same quiet defiance that had kept him alive decades earlier. Others echoed him: medics, gunners, radio operators, each telling a version of the same truth, that Ripcord had been won by the men no one expected to endure. Even so, official acknowledgement was slow to come. The Army avoided revisiting Ripcord for years, reluctant to reopen wounds or re-examine decisions that had cost so many lives. Veterans pushed for recognition, unit citations, commendations, even a formal acknowledgement of what had happened. But bureaucracy moved at its usual pace. By the time some medals were awarded in the 2000s, many of the original soldiers were already gone. For those still alive, the honors felt hollow. "It's not about the medals," said one survivor. "It's about the fact that we existed, that they can't pretend we didn't." In the end, the memory of Ripcord lived not in records or museums, but in the recollections of those who had been there. They met occasionally, in church halls, veteran centers, and community gatherings, to speak the names of the men who hadn't come home. They told their sons and daughters that bravery wasn't a uniform or a rank, but a moment when you refused to give up even when the world said you would. Ripcord survivors carried that truth quietly through the rest of their lives. They went back to cities like Detroit, Baltimore, and Chicago, where war stories were rarely believed or welcomed. Some found peace, others didn't. But whenever they spoke of those weeks in July 1970, their words were the same: calm, factual, stripped of sentiment. "We weren't heroes," Riggins once said. "We were just the ones who stayed when everyone said we'd run." And that, more than any citation or after-action report, was the legacy of Ripcord, the endurance of men who were written out of history, but who refused to disappear. Firebase Ripcord was one of the last large-scale battles fought by American troops in Vietnam, yet it slipped almost entirely into the shadows of history. When the siege ended in July 1970, the Pentagon released only a brief statement, a strategic withdrawal after a limited engagement. There was no footage, no press coverage, no ceremony for the men who had survived. In an America already divided by protest and politics, Ripcord was seen as another costly mistake in a war most wanted to forget. For the soldiers who had held the hill, that silence felt like betrayal. In the months after the battle, the 101st Airborne Division was ordered to prepare for withdrawal from the A Shau Valley. The focus shifted to winding down operations, not honoring them. Promotions and decorations were given out unevenly. Citations for heroism were buried under paperwork. Many of the black soldiers who had carried the defense received nothing. No medals, no formal recognition, not even mention in the official records. When questioned, commanders claimed there were no individual acts distinguishable from unit performance. The truth was that the Army, struggling with internal racial tension and external political pressure, preferred to bury what Ripcord represented. The war at home had changed the narrative of heroism. By 1970, returning soldiers were often met not with applause, but with suspicion. For African American veterans, the return was even harsher. They came home to neighborhoods ravaged by unemployment, to cities simmering with racial unrest, and to a nation unwilling to listen. Men who had endured the siege of Ripcord found themselves back in a different kind of battle, for dignity, for recognition, for survival. Their uniforms no longer commanded respect. In many cases, they invited hostility. Decades later, historians began to revisit the forgotten engagement. Researchers at the Vietnam Center and Archive at Texas Tech University uncovered the after-action reports of the 101st Airborne Division. Within those pages were terse, technical descriptions: sustained artillery bombardment, exceptional defensive posture, extreme casualty rate.
Nowhere did it describe who had manned the guns, who had retrieved ammunition under fire, or who had refused evacuation to hold the perimeter. The reports treated the defenders as interchangeable, faceless components of a military machine. It was only through oral histories that the missing details began to surface.
Those interviews, recorded decades after the fact, revealed a very different picture. Veterans spoke not only about the battle, but about the quiet defiance that defined it. They described the black medics who worked by flashlight through nights of shelling, the gunners who stayed at their posts after their squads were wiped out, and the helicopter crews who flew missions that command had labeled suicidal. In those voices, the siege of Ripcord came alive again, not as a statistic, but as human endurance. The soldiers who had been dismissed as unreliable had, in fact, been the reason the base had held as long as it did.
But the recognition that followed was partial, fragmented, and far too late. A few surviving officers received medals. A handful of citations mentioned distinguished gallantry. None of those awards noted the racial composition of the units involved. For the black soldiers, who had already fought against prejudice in their own ranks, the omission was familiar. They had done the work, bled for the hill, and yet remained invisible in the official story. "We were ghosts in their reports," one veteran said. "They couldn't write our names without changing the whole picture." In 1988, nearly 20 years after the battle, a reunion of the 101st Airborne Division was held in Kentucky. Among the gray-haired paratroopers who gathered in folding chairs and exchanged photographs were several black veterans from Ripcord. They talked quietly among themselves, comparing memories, filling in gaps in each other's recollections. Some had gone decades without mentioning the siege to anyone. "You can't explain it," one said. "You tell people you were there, and they look at you like you made it up, because nobody ever heard of it." The men laughed, not bitterly, but with the weary acceptance of those who no longer expected the world to understand. Slowly, pieces of recognition began to appear. The names of Ripcord's dead were carved into the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C., in the order of their deaths, indistinguishable from the tens of thousands of others. Veterans groups began lobbying for official acknowledgement of the battle's significance, but bureaucratic indifference persisted. The story of Ripcord was too complex, too grim, and too politically inconvenient to revive. The war's ending narrative was one of withdrawal, not endurance. A 1970 siege that had cost hundreds of lives for no visible gain did not fit into that picture. For the men who had been there, especially the black soldiers who had carried the burden of disbelief long before the first shell fell, the lack of recognition became part of the legacy itself. It proved, in a way, the same truth they had lived on that hill, that courage did not depend on acknowledgement. They had fought for each other, not for headlines. "Nobody came to rescue us," one veteran said. "We rescued ourselves." That statement, more than any citation or commendation, summed up the ethos of Ripcord. As the decades passed, the memory of Ripcord faded from public consciousness, but among the surviving veterans it grew sharper. They gathered in small reunions, sometimes in church halls, sometimes in VFW basements, to tell the story in full. They spoke of the helicopters that never made it back, the thunder that rolled across the valley for 3 straight weeks, and the men who kept firing even when the sky was on fire. They remembered not just the fight, but the feeling, the silence that followed, the knowledge that no one beyond that hill would ever truly know what they had done. There were no monuments dedicated specifically to Ripcord, and certainly none to the African American soldiers who fought there. Yet, in the absence of stone or bronze, memory became its own memorial. Every time a veteran told the story, in a classroom, a veterans meeting, or an interview, the hill lived again. They kept it alive through words, because words were all they had been given. "You don't need a statue," one former medic said. "You just need someone to remember who didn't run."
In military textbooks, Ripcord is now sometimes mentioned briefly, a precursor to the U.S. withdrawal, a lesson in command decisions under fire. The human story remains buried between lines of analysis. But to those who survived, the siege remains the defining moment of their lives, a test of endurance, loyalty, and identity that no official version could erase. They were men who had been told they couldn't lead, couldn't last, couldn't fight. And yet, when the world burned, they were the ones still standing on the hill. Firebase Ripcord never became a symbol of victory, but it became something rarer, a quiet testament to persistence. It stands, in memory if not in monument, as proof that bravery needs no audience. For the men who fought there, recognition never came from medals or headlines. It came from the simple fact of survival, from knowing that when everything collapsed, they did not.
Today, the hill in the A Shau Valley is overgrown, reclaimed by jungle. The bunkers are gone, the craters filled with rain. Only fragments of metal and bone remain buried in the soil. But for those who once defended it, Ripcord endures, not as a place, but as a promise that courage, even unacknowledged, still matters. A promise that history, however slow, eventually finds the names it tried to forget. And somewhere in that quiet green valley, beneath layers of time and silence, lies the memory of the man who stayed, the ones who proved, once and forever, that valor does not require recognition. It only requires the will to stand when the sky falls.